Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to many of you overseas, and to our over 500 colleagues around the world and friends joining us today for today's event. I'm Mike Sprague. I'm the director of the Polar Institute. It's my honor to welcome you to today's program entitled Inuit, the Arctic We Want. I want to thank Michaela Stith for her leadership in helping to craft today's program. And I also want to thank my friends at the Wilson Center's Science, Technology, and Innovation Program, the Kennan Institute, the Canada Institute, and the Environmental Change and Security Program for supporting today's discussion. And as always, my continued appreciation to our colleagues at Laguna Corporation for making the programs like this possible. We simply could not do this work without them. And of course, I want to thank today's co-sponsor, the Inuit Circumpolar Council. You know, just over 3 years ago in 2018, Inuit delegates from Alaska, Greenland, Canada, and Chukotka met for the 13th General Assembly of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, or ICC, under the theme Inuit, the Arctic We Want. Delegates discussed their concerns and developed actions to address these concerns. This very important gathering culminated in the adoption of the Utqiaġvik Declaration, which reflects Inuit priorities at the international level and has served as the mandate and foundation for the ICC's work to date, and in fact, through 2022. We have a distinguished group of speakers with us, leaders all in their own right, who will share with us important perspectives and reflections about the Utqiaġvik Declaration and accomplishments to date. And now to the program. I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Daly Sambo-Doro, Chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, who will open today's discussion and introduce our speakers. I will rejoin the program after all of our colleagues have spoken and engage in a very brief discussion and take some of your questions. And you can send us your questions at polar@wilsoncenter.org, polar@wilsoncenter.org. Daly, my thanks to you and ICC for partnering with the Wilson Center on this very important program. And I now turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. First of all, allow me to thank both Mike and Michaela Stith for this extraordinary opportunity. And as Mike has stated, it is my hope that we continue perhaps focusing on thematic issues as we go forward. But again, I look forward to the opportunity to collaborate further with the Wilson Center. In June of 1977, members of the Inuit family gathered in Utqiaġvik, Alaska, at the first ever Inuit Circumpolar Conference, hosted by the late Evan Hobson, then mayor of the North Slope Borough. The vision was to set a course to organize as a political entity in order to bring about a coherent Arctic policy, and more importantly, to become the united voice of Inuit at the international level. At that time, Inuit faced a host of challenges, ranging from offshore oil and gas development by others, to an IWC moratorium on Inuit whaling, to impacts of the Cold War, to land claims agreements. Many of the same issues remain, or they have resurged in a new and different way. However, we have emerged as an important force in the world community and certainly within the Arctic community. Today, the Inuit Circumpolar Council is recognized as a non-governmental organization and as an Indigenous peoples organization that works to advance the shared priorities of Inuit living throughout Inuit Nunat. Our homelands encompass Inuit communities throughout Chukotka in the Russian Far East, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. And we carry out our work through research, advocacy, and representation. The ICC's mandate is determined by delegates to the organization's quadrennial General Assembly. General Assembly delegates develop the organization's mandate and appoint a chair that serves a 4-year term. As Mike indicated, my term ends in just under a year. To date, the chairmanship rotates between Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. It's our hope that one day our Siberian Yupik members will be able to host a General Assembly and chair this organization in the future. Implementation of ICC's mandate is led by the chair, in this case myself, as well as the Executive Council, whose activities are supported by our offices in Anadyr, Anchorage, Ottawa, and Nuuk. At the 2018 General Assembly, held in Alaska, delegates adopted the Utqiaġvik Declaration that focused upon the continuing need to advocate for Indigenous human rights and international partnerships at the UN, the Arctic Council, and other intergovernmental fora. Food security, families and youth, health and wellness, education and language, Indigenous knowledge, sustainable wildlife management, environment, and sustainable development, with specific directives in each of these areas. Though we're an international organization, today we want to focus upon the national or domestic matters of concern to our membership in Alaska. As many may know, and as Mike has underscored, each of our presenters are clearly independently very capable leaders in their own right. Yet we wanted to use this forum today to illustrate the linkages to the overall directives of the Inuit Circumpolar Council and those of our Alaska membership. So we're extremely fortunate to have leadership from each of our 4 regions in Alaska. We're joined by Vivian Corthius, the Chief Executive Officer of the Association of Village Council Presidents in Southwest Alaska, Gail Schubert, President of the Bering Strait Native Corporation, Liz Cravallo, the Vice President of Lands for NANA, Harry Brower Jr., the Mayor of the North Slope Borough, and also Joshua Vo, the General Manager of Kadiak LLC. Joshua is also an emerging leader with a program created by the Alaska office some time ago. We're also fortunate to have the ICC Alaska Vice President and Executive Council member, Vera Metcalf, who also happens to be the director of the Eskimo Walrus Commission. So again, we're very fortunate to have the time of these representatives. To start off the discussion, I'd like to call upon Vivian Corthius to give her perspectives on the priorities for her region. Please, Vivian, you have the floor.
Good morning, Daly. This is a sound check.
You're good.
Thank you, Daly. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to Mike and Daly for the introduction this morning. I'm sitting here in Bethel, connected by the internet, but I'm also on audio because the internet is not dependable right now. So I do have a PowerPoint presentation this morning, and it has approximately 12 slides, and I'm happy to proceed with the presentation. The opportunity that we have this morning to talk about our region, I'm really grateful for it. So I'm going to step right into the PowerPoint. The topic of my discussion this morning is the Arctic we want, Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta in Western Alaska. By way of introduction, my name is Vivian Corthius. My Yupik name is Aningan. I am Yupik. I am a Imangak tribal member. I grew up in Imangak and St. Michael, and I live here in Bethel. I serve as the Chief Executive Officer for the Association of Village Council Presidents. I've been here for 19 years. In the last 5 years, I've served as CEO. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about the Association of Village Council Presidents. We are a regional nonprofit tribal consortium serving the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta and Bering Sea coast in Western Alaska. We are the largest tribal consortium in the United States with 56 federally recognized tribes as members located in 48 villages. Our purpose is to provide essential services for the people of our region. We are a member of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Alaska chapter. Next. So in going along with the idea or the issue of our talk here today, I wanted to present a short overview of the region and then step right into the issues. Overall, for our region, we really want to protect the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta of our, because it's our homeland. We are located in Western Alaska along the Yukon River, Kuskokwim River, and Bering Sea coast. Our region is primarily Yupik, Chupik, and Athabaskan, and we are located in 48 villages. The Delta has approximately 30,000 people in 58,000 square miles. We live in the Arctic off-the-road system and travel with small aircraft, boats, and snow machines in the wintertime. We see ourselves as living in extreme rural America on the nation's northernmost border along the Bering Sea coast of Alaska. Next. So again, keeping this in line with the theme, we want to continue to work on the tribal priorities for the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta region. And these are public safety, that's the #1 priority from our villages, from our tribes in our region. Economic development, community wellness, subsistence, climate change, transportation, infrastructure, and tribal sovereignty. We don't have time in today's presentation to talk about all of these, and I'll touch on just a couple of them. Next. So for the region's #1 priority, which is public safety, we want public safety in each of our communities. And again, we have 48 villages with 56 tribes. That's a very, very large need. The 56 tribes in the AVCP region have prioritized public safety as the #1 priority. Of the 48 villages in the AVCP region, 2/3 need a new or renovated public safety building. Half of all the villages lack dedicated public safety housing. A public safety disaster was declared by the U.S. Attorney General Barr in rural Alaska in 2019. We want the state of Alaska and the United States of America to partner with AVCP to plan and fund a public safety model that works in our region. And we've been working on this for quite some number of years, and we still need to find that path forward. Just to pause and give you some information, yesterday I checked and we have no less than 4 public safety officers in our region at the moment, and that is not acceptable. We are not asking for anything more or anything less than anywhere in Alaska or the United States, and that is basic public safety. We also want to protect our traditional and cultural values. Next slide. As Yupik, we are rich in culture and tradition. We want to continue to speak our Yupik language in our villages and in our classrooms. We want to continue to practice spring, summer, fall, and winter camps, and all the annual subsistence hunting, fishing, gathering, and sharing of food to feed our families. We want to protect our way of life for our children, grandchildren, and future generations. Next. We also want to protect our subsistence resources. We are a salmon people living on the Yukon River, Kuskokwim River, and Bering Sea coast. Salmon is the basis of our culture. This past summer, we witnessed for the first time ever a catastrophic salmon collapse. We want the state of Alaska and the federal government to work with tribes to find answers and make changes to restore the salmon back into our rivers. We also want a seat at the table when the decisions are made regarding our salmon. Next. We want to continue to be a strong voice for our people by advocating for tribal self-determination and self-governance, strengthening the fabric at the village level through infrastructure development, protecting our youth, families, and communities, growing our own by incorporating our knowledge, education, and traditional values, and delivering essential services at the village, sub-regional, and regional levels in the YK Delta. Next, we want to continue working with our partners towards the Arctic we want. The 56 tribes in the Yukon Kuskokwim Delta live in the Arctic all year round. We live here. We have families and communities that thrive in the Arctic because it is our home and has been for generations. We will be here for generations to come. We want to work with the state, the federal, and the tribal governments to improve the quality of life for our villages. In essence, we count, we matter, and we have a voice. Our partners need to work with us at all levels on the path toward the Arctic that we all want. And lastly, I think it's the most important slide, and that is we want the Arctic we want is for our children and the future generations in our region across the state. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Vivian, especially for the detailed priority areas of your region. I'd now like to turn to Gail Schubert, again, the president of Bering Strait Native Corporation. Gail?
Good morning. My name is Gail Anagik Schubert, and I'm Inuit, and I was born and raised in Yunlakleet and am a direct descendant of the last traditional chief and shaman of Yunlakleet. I grew up in the Arctic in an era where there was very little communication from the outside world. We had one Christian radio station, no television, and typically received the Anchorage Times newspaper at least 2 weeks late. We people of the Arctic relied and still rely on the land and sea for sustenance. In literally one generation, everything changed for us. Next slide, please. Our region is located in Northwest Alaska. BSNC is owned by more than 8,000 Alaska Native shareholders. Our shareholders rely on subsistence activity, which provides food security and carries forward our ancient culture's spiritual connection to the land and waters. The BSNC region is one of the most culturally diverse regions established through ANCSA. 3 distinct languages, Inuit, Siberian Yupik, and Central Yupik, are spoken in the region. For centuries, the areas north and west of Solomon were occupied by Inuit speakers, while the area to the east and south was the homeland of Yupik peoples. The people of the Diomedes and King Islands are Inuit. St. Lawrence Island is the home of the only Siberian Yupik people on the American side of the Bering Strait. Next slide, please. This map shows the proximity of the lands in our region to Russia. Numerous families in the villages in our region have Russian ancestry. We are Russia's next door neighbor. The Diomede Islands are about 3 miles apart in the middle of the Bering Strait, with the Chukchi Sea to the north and the Bering Sea to the south. In the 1980s, there were cultural exchanges and visits between the two Diomedes. Later, families were literally walled off from each other when the two countries closed the borders. Next slide, please. Here's another slide that shows where we are in relation to Russia. Climate change has led to competition for Arctic resources. The Bering Strait, which is largely uncharted and has relatively shallow waters, is a mere 50 miles across from the US side to the Russian side, and that is commonly known as the choke point. Our region lies on the narrowest point between the North American continent and Eastern Eurasia, and our villages and Angska lands line the choke point. Russia has declared that the Arctic is our land and waters, not our land, but their land and waters. So everyone has probably read or heard that last fall and this spring, Russian aircraft buzzed the American fishing fleet in open waters of the Bering Sea. That was a very interesting event from my perspective, and pretty aggressive. Next slide, please. President Putin's new military strategy clearly emphasizes protection of Russian interests in the Arctic. It's clear that a new Cold War is brewing. Restoration of the Russian military infrastructure in the Arctic began in 2012. The Russian Defense Ministry is building or restoring facilities on the Russian continent and Russia's Arctic islands, including facilities located on Big Diomede in the Bering Strait. The Russians aren't our only concern in the Arctic. The Chinese want equal trade access to Arctic waters as well. Chinese vessels have on several occasions breached Russian territorial waters without permission. And in 2015, they sent Marines on an exercise at the Bering Strait. Next slide, please. This slide just shows Russia's commitment to the Arctic. While the US regularly has aircraft in the Arctic skies and submarines traversing Arctic waters, we have no show of force in the Arctic, but maybe we don't need that. Next slide, please. As I said earlier, it can't be denied that China has a strong interest in the Arctic. They have sought participation in Arctic governance through the Arctic Council. They are promoting bilateral relations with the Arctic states for strategic purposes, and this includes substantial investments in Canada, Greenland, and Denmark. And they're also establishing and improving bilateral diplomatic relations with the 5 Northern European countries, Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. It's my personal opinion that the native Arctic people are not benefiting from Chinese investment. And I think that that has been proven over the course of time when those countries cannot afford to pay the financial requirements on those loans. China has also interests in shipping, resource development, and polar research in the Arctic. China's policy goals in the Arctic involve 4 key principles: understand, protect, develop, and participate in the governance of the Arctic. What do we in the Arctic want? We want assurance that the US recognizes the critical importance of the Arctic and ensures that American interests in the Arctic are protected, and that includes development. We want the Port of Nome built out. We want US investment in other infrastructure on our Arctic shores. Next slide, please. Strong and resilient Arctic communities can change international political behavior and outcomes. As stated, our nation's strategic competitors with interests in the region have invested heavily in infrastructure and capabilities. And this includes ice-capable vessels, improved communications, and new or updated ports and airports. We have an aging icebreaker fleet, which hopefully is going to change shortly. China is building more icebreakers than what the United States has. We seem to be a reluctant Arctic nation. It seems difficult at times to convince Congress that Alaska is worth investing in. And this includes the American Arctic particularly. And that is because we have abundant natural resources and we are strategically located in the Arctic. As stated, we need to build strong and resilient Arctic communities by investing in ports, functional and logistically situated airfields and roads. We need infrastructure investments in the Arctic to ensure that our nation's borders are protected and that there are resources available to deal with a spill, discharge, or other event that might happen in the Arctic. Next slide, please. Subsistence still plays a huge part in the cultural identity of many Arctic peoples. And for many, it's still an essential part of our livelihoods. And illegal fishing in international waters has impacted our communities. You know, I think that it's no secret that there have been failures of the salmon run, both in our region and in the Bethel region. We have had salmon species either not show up or show up late. And part of that can probably be attributed to climate change, but the disappearance of whole fish species that typically come back to regions, I think, is more problematic and may indicate interception on the high seas. Alaska Native people have a wealth of ecological knowledge based on our own observations of the environment and on information handed down over the generations. This much is clear: whatever development or other activities that happen in the Arctic, whether on shore or offshore, must be done in a manner that protects subsistence resources. Next slide, please. This is a family photo that I like to show. I have several of these photos, but these are members of my family. Next slide, please. More members of my family, and you can see in the back, kind of on the right-hand side, the woman with the little, it almost looks like a point in her hair. That's my mother. And she was probably 18 or 19 years old. She's almost 95 years old now. Next slide, please. Here's a family photo of my 5-generation family members. On the far right is my oldest sister, Rose. My mom is holding her. My grandma, Martha Nanauk, is next to her. My great-grandmother, Meocha, otherwise known as Marion Ganungnan, is next to her. And next to my great-grandmother is Lena Williams, who was the wife of the last traditional chief and shaman of Yinlikli. Next slide, please. I like to include this photo as well. You all probably recognize the 2 military folks that are standing around Chief Olokana, who is my great-grandmother's half-brother, and he was the last traditional chief of King Island. Next slide, please. My family has lived and survived in the Arctic for hundreds of years, and we hope to continue to do so, even as the Arctic changes and develops. The Arctic has been our homeland for thousands of years, and its waters continue to sustain our people and way of life. The region holds new promise, and Bering Straits Native Corporation has the vision, values, and resources to help develop it in a way that will benefit our people, Alaska, and the world for generations to come. In sum, what do we want? We want to continue to live our lives in the Arctic and thrive as we do so. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Gail, for your presentation, and in particular, those beautiful family photos, generations of your family and our people, and also for underscoring some of the crucial issues, including the geopolitical issues that face all of us. And in my estimation, that also elevates the important role of the Inuit Circumpolar Council at the international level. I'd now like to call upon Liz Cravallo from NANA Corporation. As I mentioned earlier, she's the Vice President of Lands, and I look forward to your contribution. Liz, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Let me get my PowerPoint corrected here. All right. So I'm really pleased to be here today to speak with all of you. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are listening in to our conversation today. My traditional name is Koluk, it's Inuit. I'm from Kotzebue, Alaska, which is also called Kikik-Tagruk in our traditional language. And I'm going to be talking about a range of issues today. But before I get started, I wanted to also acknowledge my other counterparts who are not speaking today on behalf with me with Northwest Alaska, who are a part of ICC, and that's Percy Ballot with Manilik Association and Miles Cleveland with the Northwest Arctic Borough. Both our borough and our Tribal Health and Social Service nonprofit Manilik Association, working with NANA, are all part of ICC and really believe in the common vision that is shared with ICC. So I wanted to talk a little bit about NANA and the region and the people of our area, and then go a little bit global, and then talk about a few key examples that I want to share with all of you today. So Northwest Alaska, or the NANA region, which is also the Manilik service area and the Northwest Arctic Borough, has about 7,600 people within it. Over 80% of this population identifies as Alaska Native, and it's even a higher number for those of us who are of mixed heritage with our Inupiaq ancestry. I think a key thing that I like to share, especially with folks who are from agencies within the government, is that we do not have any roads connecting our communities. All transportation between our communities happens by air, by river, or over the land or the snow in the wintertime. This region is about the size of Indiana, is about 38,000 square miles. So for those of you who are not familiar with Alaska Native corporations, we are a for-profit corporation with a social responsibility to our people. Even though the region has 7,600 people, NANA has over 14,900 shareholders that own the corporation and are invested in the management of our land and our resources. All of these shareholders have a descendancy that is connected to our region and to our people. So even though we're talking about a geographic location, much like ICC, we're talking about a people who transcend that location. Manilik Association is the Tribal Health and Social Service nonprofit organization that our tribes partnered to create, and they deliver a number of important services to our communities. The Manilik Health Center in our region provides elder care support and emergency services and general primary care services, and each of our villages really only have clinics in them with people who have done a lot of work to respond to the pandemic this past year. The Northwest Arctic Borough, which is our agency, our government agency of the state of Alaska, really is there to implement infrastructure to support our villages in our region and support local management of education in our region. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So the Inupiaq, there are a couple key concepts that I just want to share. One of them is that in our region, we often talk about the Inuit Illiquisate. And these are 17 values that were recorded or translated from our elders in the 70s in a really significant effort to make sure that we don't lose what the meaning of these Illiquisate are as we are losing our language. So there's a lot of work going in to maintain this. Some key ones to me that are very important are, I mean, all of them are very important, but one that really stands out to me is that responsibility to tribe and the importance of how we work together for our common interests. The Illiquisate means essentially it makes us what makes us who we are as a people. Before we move on, I know a number of our other speakers have talked about this. I want to highlight the importance of our subsistence culture. I think a lot of folks see subsistence culture or have heard of it. I think of just hunting and gathering. The work that we've done at ICC has really talked about the importance of food security and that subsistence is much more than just hunting and gathering. It's also a way of life, and it is a mechanism for understanding our place in the environment and within it. As Inuit, we do not see ourselves as separate from the environment, but a part of it, and we have a responsibility to steward and be good stewards of the environment and the resources that we depend upon. So talking more globally, I wanted to highlight in Inuit Nunaat, there's about 155,000 Inuit. We have shared culture, languages, and values, and we have been here for over 10,000 years. We have inhabited these lands for that time, and these are our homelands. We live in multiple political and national jurisdictions, which can make it very challenging across our different regions to find ways to ensure that we're protecting our way of life and our cultural survival. With that in mind, I wanted to hit on a couple of concepts around self-determination that are talked about within the ICC context. And the reason I think this is important is because we live in multiple political jurisdictions, we are all dealing with different mechanisms that we can use for self-determination. And I think it's important to be aware of that as we think about how we partner with agencies in the national context, but also do our work in the international context. Daley referred to the Inuit Arctic policy, and there is a really good quote in here, essentially talking about the importance of that recognition in our national legal systems. But also, I really appreciated one of the comments that Daley made in her remarks as the incoming chair at our last ICC General Assembly, essentially stating that we must ensure that all Inuit at all levels are not hindered and stifled in their expression of self-determination in every realm. In this regard, we must be able to freely pursue our economic, social, and cultural development. And I really want you all to think about that. What does that really mean as we think about a shared Arctic with the United States and the rest of the country, but also with other political jurisdictions, and how this is reflected through our work at the United Nations, the Arctic Council, but also our work with you on US national security policies and co-management of our subsistence resources. Well, what does self-determination really look like in action? A lot of the themes that I see in the work with ICC and in our communities focus on the importance of what we can do to maximize how we implement our education structures, how we are looking at how we implement our health and social services, how we are looking at how we ensure our cultural survival, but also the ways in which we choose to participate in economic development that are in line with who we are, our value systems, and that support our overall self-determination. Working at an Alaska Native corporation, it can be very challenging to explain how a for-profit business is one tool of self-determination for Inupiaq people in our region. Because we are the landowner and we've retained the majority of our traditional lands in our region, which still only represents about 10% of the lands in our region, it puts us in a different position in how we make our decisions about land use and how we work with our local communities to consider what those impacts to livelihood may be, because livelihood is both the ability to have a job and earn income, and it's also that core and critical component to participate in our subsistence way of life and ensure cultural survival. So I want to shift gears for a quick moment and talk about this a little bit more. In terms of self-determination and our common shared interests among Inuit, there is also our common shared interest with the United States. The United States talks a lot about the importance of national security and our protection of natural resources and the economic development opportunities that exist in the Arctic. The Arctic is a high-cost environment that is faced with the challenges of climate change, and all of those things impact infrastructure deployment in our region. The majority of the lands in our area are state or federally owned, and so even within that context, how we consider the deployment of infrastructure within these political jurisdictions is really key. So when we think about the context of the Arctic, we can often get stuck in the common issue of lack of interest that Gail talked about in the Arctic space, unless it's only around national security. And it's easy, I think, for the general public in the United States to think of the Arctic as this beautiful landscape with animals that does not have very much development and not very many people. And the reality is that it may be true that we do not have a lot of people. And yes, we are really blessed with a number of animals, but there is a lot of resource development happening in the Arctic or being looked to happen in the Arctic. This map is a little bit outdated, but I wanted to share it in the context of what it is that we're paying attention to. Within our own region, there are certainly resource development opportunities, but also we see what Russia is doing, the interest that China has, as well as our other Nordic counterparts are doing in the Arctic to develop it. And how do we consider how we play in that context of economic development, but also our responsibility to find that right balance between development and ensuring that we're protecting our environment and our resources. I'm going to jump into some hyper-local examples on some of these challenges that are facing our communities, because as we talk about that global interest, there are immediate impacts that are impacting our communities with respect to climate change that I want to talk about. So I'm going to share this video, and I told Mike I wouldn't use the audio because there might be some cussing because of some fear. But let me play this video for you all. This is in Noatak, which is an inland river community. So what you're seeing is a road that leads to the airport in the community. And right now the community is working on relocation of the airport because the river is essentially eroding away there at the road and the community and is getting closer and closer to the airport. And as I mentioned, in our region, air is one of the primary modes of transportation. And so for any sort of medical services, fuel deliveries, grocery deliveries, all of that comes in by air. So as you can imagine, in terms of safety, what this is like for our community. And I know for agencies, there's also that concern of how we deploy infrastructure to ensure that we can continue to adapt to these kinds of changes. When it comes to subsistence and livelihood in our region, another significant concern that we have is around the impacts of climate change on our communities and specifically on subsistence activities. We're facing issues of erosion, inundation, which is rising water, extreme weather, ice conditions, permafrost, all of these different issues that are talked about here. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight was the native village of Kotzebue, which was recently featured in Arctic Today, did a study talking about the impacts of the change in sea ice conditions and the patterns of how our hunters are going out to hunt ugruk and ice seals in the fall and the spring seasons. Some of the things that we're seeing in our communities additionally is the change in caribou migratory patterns and what that means for individuals who are trying to go out to hunt. So as you can imagine, both the predictability of species to do what they normally do and what we traditionally understand is changing, but additionally, the cost to go out and get those species for individuals and communities is increasing because of those changes. The risks that hunters are taking to continue to access those resources are increasing, and so safety is a significant concern. But also, as these changes come up, we know that there are conversations around conservation districts that are happening and sometimes not inclusive of our people. So we need to find ways to ensure that we're protecting our right to access subsistence resources, while also finding ways to work with agencies to adapt to these conditions because they have very real and significant impacts on our people. I want to talk for a moment about infrastructure. Infrastructure is something that we've been challenged with continually in our communities. In our region, this is a picture of Kivalina there on the left. Then on the right, we have the water treatment facility in Kobuk. Down in the bottom left is a Kotzebue cellular tower, and down in the bottom right are solar panels that are being deployed in Deering. And I think there's a number of issues that these images capture. Erosion and inundation threaten communities like Kivalina, as well as Deering and Noatak and Selawik. Significant failures to water and sewer are happening due to extreme weather conditions and also pandemic-related issues. This past season, we had 3 communities with water sewer treatment plant facility failures due to the lack of availability of parts due to the pandemic and the intersection with extreme weather events in our communities. So that challenge to ensure safety in our community during a global pandemic was impacted by these weather conditions. Additionally, the cost to operate these facilities when they're faced with things like $9 to $10 gallons of home heating fuel is very significant, which is why we're doing what we can to install renewable energy on these types of facilities and in homes in our communities. Broadband continues to be a significant issue, and as our children had to work to go to school from home this last season, we're really challenged to make sure that we have the kind of connectivity to participate, the same challenges that you're seeing Vivian face right now. The last piece that I want to touch on is sustainable development. I have a couple of slides here, and I know that this is an area that I talk about quite a bit because Nana is the landowner for the Red Dog Mine. I really want to emphasize that if you have a chance to take a look at the ICC Natural Resource Declaration, that you take the time to look at it. ICC and our member organizations, I think, attempt to strive and find that balance between responsible development and ensuring our subsistence livelihood is protected in our environment. This is an example that I wanted to share with you briefly, and that's that the Red Dog Mine, which is situated on Nana lands, is one of the largest lead and zinc mines in the world. But this mine has an integral component called the Subsistence Committee, and this committee uses traditional knowledge of subsistence to minimize or eliminate impacts to operations, including things like setting the shipping season, ensuring that there's no conflict with caribou migration, which you can see a picture of there along the road that connects the port to the mine site, and then also provides input on what it's going to look like when we reclaim and restore this. Looping back to self-determination, the reason that NANA pursued this mining opportunity was the ability to use these funds both to protect our resources longer term, but to ensure that there was livelihood for our people to participate in the economy. In addition, the Northwest Arctic Borough leverages the payment in lieu of taxes that the borough provides to support our education systems, public safety, and other infrastructure that's critical to our communities. So this is one way that we are using the things in our national jurisdiction to ensure that we can promote self-determination. I want to wrap up and talk a little bit for a moment about that self-determination component. Each of these areas that I've showed you are some very hyper-local examples of challenges that we face in our communities. And what we've found, I think, is that it is critical that we continue to tap into our values. And one of those values that I remember Levi Cleveland talking to me about when I first moved home 10 years ago was this concept of a dochikun, that our communities work together as one to tackle these challenges. And I would invite you as agencies to recognize that we have been here for 10,000 years, that we have found ways to work together as one to adapt to our environment and our changing environment. We recognize that we have common and shared interests with the United States and with each other across the circumpolar Arctic. So let's work together as one to find tools for adaptation, ways to use co-management and indigenous knowledge and research to really adapt to climate change and the challenges that face our communities, and address these issues around infrastructure and climate change. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Daly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Liz, for a substantive and packed presentation, but also for highlighting important values, as well as the vitality of our way of life and some of the challenges, as you referred to, the high cost environment of the Arctic and the importance and significance of the balance between sustainable development and protection of the environment, and the significant pivotal element of knowledge, Indigenous knowledge. I'm very pleased to move to our next speaker, Harry Brower Jr., as I said earlier, Mayor of the North Slope Borough, and I look forward to your contribution. Harry, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Daly and Mike, for setting up the program today. And I'd like to thank all the presenters that have already presented. It covered a lot of information. In my Inuit language, good morning. I'm Inuit. I'm a husband, I'm a father, grandfather, a hunter, a whaling captain, and the mayor of the North Slope Borough. The North Slope Borough is the largest municipality by area in the United States. It is the core of the US Arctic, and is the area regional government for 8 villages stretched across northern Alaska. Today, I will talk about enhancing infrastructure and co-management needs in the Arctic. I have lived in the northernmost community of Barrow, now called Utqiaġvik, for my entire life. I have subsisted off the resources of the ocean, lakes, rivers, and land as my ancestors did for millennia. The Arctic that I and my fellow Inuit want is an Arctic where our children and grandchildren have the God-given human right for food security, food sovereignty, which includes food security. We also want the sustainable development of our resources. These desires are equivalent to what most of my fellow US citizens take for granted in the lower 48. I hope my time on this panel today will give you a better sense of where we can work together. We want to work together to ensure our communities in the Arctic have the food they need to nourish their bodies and souls, and that we can responsibly develop our resources to maintain and improve our livelihood. I want to remind you, there are no permanent roads connecting our North Slope villages to the rest of the world or to each other. Nearly all of our essential supplies including materials and machine medicine are brought in by ocean-going barges during the summer or by plane. The costs are very high. They are felt every day by families just trying to secure the food, clothing, fuel, and other basic needs. The costs are providing the materials and resources needed to build and maintain schools, health clinics, water and sewer system, public safety, adequate housing, communication systems, and other critical facilities and services. These high costs add up. These costs create a constant challenge to overcome and greatly impact the quality of life in our communities. Therefore, we have to work together to address infrastructure needs and food sovereignty to ensure our kids don't experience unnecessary disasters or hardships here in the Arctic. Here are examples of recent disasters. When the only air carrier to our village went out of business during the pandemic, and when the entire community lost its water supply, we needed tools, resources, and partners to prepare for the tsunami of change that is already upon us. Excuse me. This is appropriate for the US government to support because we are US citizens. Our culture is unique and we are valuable people who contribute to the good of our country in many, many ways. About infrastructure, we have been making progress using our own resources to improve our infrastructure. We do this because our ability to levy property taxes on oil industry. But we have a long way to go to even equal what most Americans already have in their towns. A road system will improve transportation to build up our infrastructure. We have built seasonal ice roads, community winter access trails for the past 5 years. These trails provided a new way of bringing necessary goods and equipment to our communities. However, these ice roads only last a couple of months, are expensive, and can be dangerous. Partnerships to create gravel roads will put the foundation in place to help build the infrastructure. We need these roads to improve the health and well-being of our communities and address and increase the activity that is coming to the Arctic. In addition to the high cost to build, we see impacts of permafrost thaws and coastal erosion on our already limited housing and water and sewer systems. Due to this tsunami of Arctic change, which is not caused by us, we are carrying the load of the cost and impact to our infrastructure, and we need your help. I would like to also talk about our subsistence resources. Subsistence hunting, fishing, and gathering feeds our bodies and our souls. This approach to living has been going on for millennia and keeps our community strong together. We have a right to be involved in the management of those resources. About co-management, we are part of the Arctic ecosystem. The fish, the wildlife regulations imposed on us are impacting our ability to have food sovereignty. An example we can learn from is our Inuit counterpart in northern Canada. They have much more control over their living resources in a system that works to support food sovereignty. As Inupiaq, we have our own rules, regulations, values, and traditional hunting practices that we take very seriously and have been developed over millennia. When I go hunting, I should be able to take the resources that are needed by my family and community. This isn't always the case. My people are often under the threat of unnecessary law enforcement, which impacts our ability to provide for our communities. Communications between agencies and my people needs to improve. We need to be trusted, respected, and listened to by our partners. We need to have a meaningful role in developing and implementing regulations. We need you to help us ensure that Inupiaq don't have a regulatory barrier that makes it harder for us to sustainably hunt and fish in changing climate. We want a system that works for us. The current co-management system is not working. We need to develop meaningful partnerships. 2, first, establish policies that make it easier for us to maintain our food sovereignty. And secondly, increase funds to co-management organizations in Alaska, especially those related to marine mammals. Right now, the co-management process creates unfunded mandates, competition among co-management groups, and a process that does not effectively address meaningful consultation of federal agencies with tribes. We need the agencies to come listen to us. We have many solutions and concrete ways forward. A great example of actions we are taking to meet some of the common goals we have is that we invest in our own research scientists who have estimated the boa whale population. In closing, we are the Arctic. We can help the US accomplish its goals and objectives because we are experienced and knowledgeable. This approach will not only benefit the US, but it will also benefit us. We are looking for a meaningful partnership that will help us address our basic human rights. We want partnership to address infrastructure and improve co-management. Individually, we don't have the capacity in the Arctic, but together we can develop an Arctic we want. And thank you again, Mike and Haley, for the opportunity.
Mhm. Utqiaġvik, Harry, for your important message about infrastructure, management of resources, co-management of resources, which essentially pivots on our way of life, and your reference also to food sovereignty. These are really important messages, but I think even more significantly was your message about partnership with others to address these challenges and problems. I am now very pleased to invite Joshua Vo to share his perspective. Joshua, as I said earlier, is a participant in the ICC Alaska Office Emerging Leaders Initiative. And the goal of the initiative is to build the next generation of Inuit leaders who are familiar with and interested in and passionate about ICC's work, thereby ensuring organizational leadership, transition, and succession. And I am very, very pleased to invite Joshua to share his perspectives on a host of issues, I'm sure. So please, Joshua, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daly. Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are. Before I get started, I'd like to thank the Polar Institute and the Wilson Center, ICC, and all of you for allowing me to speak this morning. My name is Joshua Vo, and I am one of the ICC emerging leaders. I live and primarily grew up in Anchorage, but my family's from St. Mary's, which is on the Lower Yukon River. I currently work for Koniag Government Services, which is the federal contracting sector for Regional Alaska Native Corporation, Koniag. Like I had mentioned earlier, I am part of the ICC Emerging Leaders Initiative with 5 others from Alaska. The other 5 are Jakey-Lou Oliman, Tessa Baldwin, Cynthia Ivan, Samantha Harrison, and Addie Amasuk. In addition, Eileen Adams from the ICC Alaska office has been a huge part of our program. As a quick overview, I'll be telling you about the initiative, ICC's goals out of this initiative, and the process our group decided to accomplish those goals and where we are now. The Emerging Leaders Initiative's goal is to build the next generation of Inuit leaders who are familiar and interested with ICC's work. The Emerging Leaders Initiative exposes us to ICC's work at an international level by allowing us to attend and participate in the Arctic Council, United Nations, ICC Executive Council, and ICC Alaska board meetings, while also being mentored by ICC officials. The 3 main objectives coming out of this initiative for ICC are building relationships with Alaskan Inuit youth who will learn about ICC history and current efforts at the international level by attending international meetings while being mentored by ICC leadership. These experiences will be utilized to gather insight to help determine future youth engagement efforts. Another goal is to develop recommendations from a youth perspective for improving Inuit youth interest and engagement within ICC. These recommendations will be shared and discussed with ICC leadership in anticipation of the 2022 ICC General Assembly. The last goal for the initiative is that the influence of this project will ultimately result in a future where Inuit youth are aware, interested, excited, and engaged in ICC's work and vying for leadership positions within ICC and its members. In an effort to reach these goals, we are fortunate to have been able to travel to Greenland pre-pandemic to spend a week with youth from both Canada and Greenland to figure out a way forward to provide meaningful ideas to ICC. While we were all able to share our experiences and what we thought were important to Inuit youth throughout the 4 countries, we decided to cast our net further and get more input to ensure we weren't overlooking any important issues. To do this, we created a survey that we shared throughout all of our youth networks that was available for a few months. The survey covered all the different areas that we thought may be important to Inuit youth, along with some questions in regard to youth engagement in their communities. We were fortunate enough to have great participation and came out with some good data. To dig deeper into the data that we received, we held a few virtual focus groups that were more specific to the main themes that we noticed in looking over the survey results. The main themes that we noticed from the survey results and the focus groups are: teach us and let us advocate for ourselves, building relationships, unity, and knowledge across Inuit Nunat, provide a space for Inuit youth to share and talk about experiences, intergenerational connection and bringing elders into our strategy, the use of social media, but also email and radio for parts of rural Alaska and Canada. And current successful youth outreach looks like throughout the past years have been youth committees, conferences, presentations, and webinars. After noticing and discussing these themes, our group has started the process of developing a report for ICC that lays out recommendations for ICC to implement in order to improve their engagement with our youth throughout Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Russia. I won't spill the beans on these recommendations just yet, but ICC will get them by the end of the calendar year. Before finalizing our recommendations, our group will be sharing them with youth across the 4 countries for any final input. If you are Inuit youth, keep an eye on ICC's Alaska's social media pages, as that's the platform that we use to share our events. Our first virtual event around these recommendations is happening in October. With that, thank you all again for allowing me to share some of the things that we're working on.
Great, thank you so much, Joshua. And I think it's indicative of values that we reflect in his initial acknowledgement of all the other emerging leaders that are participating in the program, as well as their initiatives to gain information and priorities from many, many others and to be inclusive. So thank you so much. I am also very pleased to invite Vera Metcalf, as I said earlier, is the ICC Alaska President, or excuse me, ICC Alaska Vice President and ICC Executive Council member from Alaska to our Executive Council. So please, Vera, the floor is yours.
I'm happy to see all of you, and good morning from Nome, Alaska. I will be actually turning off my video because of our connection here in Nome. But that, like Daly said, I am the Alaska ICC Vice President, born and raised in Savunga on St. Lawrence Island, and I currently live here in Nome, Alaska. So it is actually my great privilege to listen to the presentations of these very outstanding Alaskan Native leaders and to have an opportunity to add, hopefully, my own thoughts, and to do it, I understand, before a very distinguished audience. I also like to add my thanks to the Wilson Center, the Polar Institute, for hosting this event for ICC Alaska, and to longtime friend and colleague of ours, Dr. Shrega, for his work here and wherever on Arctic Alaska issues. And of course, to our ICC chair, Daly Sambo-Duro, and the ICC Alaska staff for making this event happen for all of us here in Alaska. So I'm going to be turning off my camera and hopefully maneuver through my PowerPoint presentation that we'll share with you all. As you've heard from many of our presenters, Arctic Indigenous people cannot be separated from our environment and natural resources. We are and always have been absolutely dependent on this very intimate relationship that many of our presenters have described with our environment and its gifts. To understand and be grounded in this dependent relationship is our cultural strength. As the Utqiaġvik Declaration explains, this core value of Inuit identity is the driving force behind the work of ICC. We Inuit, or Yup'ik, are guided by our Indigenous knowledge and culture. Our Indigenous knowledge, or IK, has developed through the millennia in this dependent and firsthand relationship with our world while we're out hunting, fishing, gathering, providing for our families and communities. This is still when our IK is experienced and learned, when our language is necessary, and when we observe our environment firsthand. You'll just notice that I'm sharing this quote from a highly respected elder, one of our Indigenous knowledge experts, Iyaka, Anders Apasungak from Gamble, when he said, "Schatgelingok, nawakosgelingok, nanreisgelingok, nasuksakak." What you do not see, do not hear, do not experience, you will really never really know. So this activities of hunting, the fishing, the gathering, sharing, then preserving, preparing, carving, sewing, and more must all be kept and supported as times of learning IK to ensure our next generation of IK knowledge bearers, like Joshua Vo, is prepared to provide our unique way of knowing to Arctic research and governance. This is where the Utqiaġvik Declaration, priorities of food security, education, and language, Indigenous knowledge, sustainable wildlife management, and environment are most directly aimed, and where progress toward Indigenous-led resource management will be critically important to the future of the Arctic, for those of us that live in the Arctic. And I would sure hope the Alaska Native leaders will agree with this reflection that our work as mayors, CEOs, presidents, vice presidents, and general managers of Indigenous communities, our tribes, and corporation is more than a job, vocation, or career. We are all committed to hearing and bearing the responsibility of the amazing and profound legacy of our ancestors, our elders, and culture and way of life, as we call it on St. Lawrence Island, Yupik, Nangaanakput, while also being committed to ensuring our next generation will find pride, empowerment, and strength within their culture, language, and identity. Our families, our large, wonderful families, our dear friends and home communities are what drives and crowns our work. Lastly, I would like to use the Mayor Ebbe Hobson Sr.'s words. Although not a nation state, as a people, we do constitute a nation. The Inuit Circumpolar Council strives to improve the lives of Arctic Indigenous people, Alaska Native people, which is evidenced by the Utqiaġvik Declaration and the many ongoing food security, environment, human health, education, language, and sustainable development work groups, the various summits, statements, and reports that ICC produces, leads and participates in at Alaska and international levels. I mean, we are absolutely very, very busy, as you can hear with all the wonderful comments shared by our very distinguished presenters. But these provide clear direction on how we can and will work with others, our federal partners that Mayor Brower mentioned, to properly govern and care for our homeland and waters. The Arctic, Inuit, Nunat, or Nunavut, because our work continues and will result in a new declaration based on our work and 4 years of changes at our next General Assembly in 2022. So yes, we remain, our communities will continue adapting, and we will rely on our Indigenous knowledge to maintain our relationship properly with our world, because it is where our food, our health, and our future will come from. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vera, not only for your presentation, but your years of service to the ICC as an executive council member, and also the voice of your people and the region specifically. I greatly appreciate how you brought to life the significance and importance of Indigenous knowledge and the profound linkages that it has to everything about us as distinct peoples. So thank you so much for those reflections. I will now turn it over to Mike to moderate the question and answer period. And I trust that after all of the substance that has been shared by our esteemed leadership here, that many questions were generated. So over to you, Mike.
Haley, thank you. And thank you for guiding that extraordinary panel. And thank you all, as many of us are friends, close friends and colleagues. But as you may have seen from my video, I was, as always, in school and taking notes. So thank you. As much as we all have worked and lived in our state and visited our communities and think we know a lot about them, every time these panels come to life, I realize how much I do not know, hence my note taking and some questions that I have for each of you. So thank you all very, very much. I want to remind the community watching us that they can send their questions to us at polar@wilsoncenter.org, polar@wilsoncenter.org. And thank you for the folks who have already sent their questions in. But I want to start, and we've got about, 40 minutes or so to do this. Perhaps I can start daily. I'll go through the run as each presenter spoke. I have a question for each of you that might provide some interesting discussion. But daily, and again, I could spend an hour with each of you, more than an hour with each of you, digging down on what you have shared with us today, but I won't do that. I'll just pick some things. Daily, one thing that I have spoken to you about and others have asked about is the relationship between ICC and the United Nations. What is that? What happens in those discussions? How are you shaping or trying to inform at the UN dialogue, not just about ICC, but the bigger, broader issues that were also brought up today? What does that look like?
Mm-hmm. Maybe I can respond by just sharing two examples. One is in relation to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This venue, this political arena, which is global, has very little information or knowledge about the reality of climate change in the Arctic region and within our homelands. And as you've heard from each speaker, there are clearly diverse impacts that are being experienced because of climate change. And I greatly appreciated Mayor Brower's indication that these changes and the adverse impacts are emerging far beyond our homelands and generated by others. So in the UNFCCC, the Inuit Circumpolar Council has been able to bring forward our views about how climate change is impacting our communities, not only within the Conference of the Parties at the UNFCCC, but also we're making headway in terms of the significance and the importance of Indigenous knowledge in relation to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and their specific reports. So that's one example of ICC being the international voice within that particular political arena. Everyone knows that climate change is impacting our homelands and our people, our communities at a much faster rate than anywhere else in the world. So our voice is significant in that context. The second example is a forthcoming initiative, the UN Food Systems Summit. Everyone has spoken about our way of life, our hunting, fishing, harvesting, and other gathering activities. One of the things that the ICC has been able to do is to bring forward this way of life, the Inuit way of life, and especially, as Mayor Brower said, the importance of the marine environment and marine mammals, or as Vivian has said, the significance of salmon, as every other speaker has underscored, Liz, for example, the hunting of caribou, Vera and her work in relation to the taking of walrus and the efforts to really ensure that our voice is heard in management and co-management decisions, but also the key element, again, of Indigenous knowledge. We have been working to influence the outcomes of the forthcoming UN Food System Summit to ensure that our distinct way of life is reflected in the outcomes. And we're working collaboratively with other Indigenous peoples organizations, but we're insistent upon the recognition of and respect for this unique way of life. For too often, or for years, the Food and Agriculture Organization has understood food systems in relation to pastoralists, to agriculture. Very, very little has emerged in terms of, again, hunting, fishing, harvesting, whaling, and other gathering throughout our homeland. So this is another way in which the ICC, in its work at the United Nations, has been able to bring the voice of Inuit, the distinct way of life of Inuit, to the international arena. And I hope that answers your question in terms of the role of the ICC within the UN. Of course, there are numerous other fora in terms of UN agencies and specialized agencies where we're active. But I think that those two examples illustrate our role at the international levels. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, Daley, thank you for that great response. I know there's a lot going on there, but those are two powerful and vivid examples of ICC and the UN relationship. And mostly it's about, of course, right, educating awareness and then influencing and informing the policies and the actions that happen there. Thank you. I'll go in order here. Vivian, I have a question for you, and wonderfully, one of our colleagues, Erica Hill, has basically asked the question that I was going to ask, and then I want to ask the same of others who would like to talk about it. You spoke about public safety being the top priority in your presentation. And so I wanted to get a sense, I think it was Liz who spoke about the size, the area that Nana serves in the area that she lives in, which is basically the size of Indiana. And as I recall, Bethel, or that particular region where you live, you're serving a small population in an area that is the size of maybe a Colorado or a Indiana or some other state in the nation. So I wonder if you could do two things for me. One would be give us a scale of the village spread in terms of a continental US spread of what the example would be. And the second is, tell us about this issue of public safety. For public safety officers in that kind of a region, think about four policemen in the size of, pick your favorite state, is without roads, is exceptionally stark and vivid. And maybe why it became number one. And then Liz and others, Erica asks the same question in your particular region. What about public safety assets and needs in your particular region? So I'm sorry for that long question, but Vivian, maybe we can start with you.
Again, I wanted to thank you for the question. I really, really appreciate that question because it is our region's number one priority. Our region is the size of a very large state in the lower 48. Many times we compare ourselves to Oregon. It's a region that spans the Yukon River, lower Yukon River on the north, the Kuskokwim River on the south, and the Bering Sea coastline. We have 48 villages and 56 tribes. For me to fly from Bethel to Email, which is my home, I can travel there by air, and it takes about an hour. I've traveled from Bethel to Providencia, and in the same time it takes me to go from, say, Kotlik, which is our northernmost village, to Providencia. It'll take the same time to go to Kotlik to Bethel. So our region sits along the Bering Sea coast. We have many of our villages along the coastline and along the river system. So the river is our highway. Over the past 5 years or so, we have worked with our region's tribes. We meet on an annual basis. And about 5 years ago, our tribes in the region prioritized all the issues and came up with a listing. And those 3 top categories, first are public safety, second is economic development, and third is community wellness. So using that as a priority list, our region has worked on public safety initiatives, the initiative for 4 or 5 years, and I'm hoping with the opportunity today with this presentation, we will spark some more interest in our challenges in our region and hopefully start moving again in the same direction that all of rural Alaska is in right now because of the lack of public safety. It's challenging to address any crisis in a community, any rural community, when you're used to having 2 working hands. In my estimation, every community has a right hand and a left hand. That right hand is the health aide and the public safety officer. When our villages don't have a public safety officer, one hand is tied behind our back. When an emergency happens, it can be a drowning, it can be a death, it can be a fire. Along the coastline, it can be an incident in the Bering Sea where either a cargo or a passenger ship has an accident, and our communities who are averaging about 400, 500, 600 people, or the larger communities with 1,300 people, or our small communities who have only 50 people. When those ships are on the Bering Sea, if they have an accident and they roll up on our shores, people usually the first responders are our people. And if you have a cell phone, if you have a signal, you usually call the VPSO, or you usually call the health aide if the health aide is needed. In many of our villages along the coastline and in our river systems, there is no public safety. So we've been working on this issue for the last 4 years. We came up with a baseline. We had studies done in our region to determine what the need is. And then I've always asked our staff, if we're going to bring up a problem, we need to also bring up a solution. So we've been asked that many times over the past 3 or 4 years, and we've created a model to hopefully use the health aid system or the creation of a health aid system within the state of Alaska to use as a benchmark as we desire at least one public safety personnel in every one of our communities across the state, in all of our rural communities. So thank you for recognizing that. I'm hoping that today's meeting with the Wilson Center will spur some encouragement to keep on going down the path to reach that goal. Thank you.
Vivian, thank you. Liz, specifically, and Mayor Brower, the question to you as well about public safety in the villages, that communities that you serve as well. But Vivian, I want to make sure that I underscore your point, which is you have 46 villages or so, and you have 4 public safety officers. The equivalent would be in the United States if somebody lived in a community and there was no police officer, absolutely none, and you had to wait for someone to either travel by air, by snow machine, by boat, by whatever, to get to your community to respond to an incident, correct? Do I have that right?
You are correct. Our villages have, right now, our villages have 3 layers of challenges, 3 layers of disasters going on. Of course, the first one right now is the pandemic. Then you layer that with the public safety crisis. And then you also layer that with, for lack of a better word, the changes in our environment, climate change, and as we're witnessing on the lower Yukon, a salmon disaster.
Thank you, Vivian. Liz, Mayor Brower, do either of you want to take on that question as well? And then Gail, I'll move on to a question for you.
Mayor Brower, do you want to go first?
You're trying to unmute the mic there. Thank you, and Mike. Thank you for the question. I think the public safety is of importance all across the North Slope. It's the minimum of operations that we identify with on the North Slope, because we have the North Slope Borough Police Department. It hires personnel, recruiting from the outside and bringing police that are on a rotational basis. And it's a very struggling atmosphere in terms of trying to keep employees that are coming from the outside into a community that they're not really oriented in yet. And it takes a little bit of time. I think the difficulties, as Vivian has stated, are similar to any situation that arises within the community, you know, whether it be a fire or an emergency call for a police or family crisis that's occurring. In trying to get a police to respond in a timely manner, because there's relays of calls being directed to the base station, which is located in Barrow, and then the officers are enacted to respond through a communication system. Sometimes it takes a few more minutes than normal in terms of the communications. Similar situation we're faced with, again, Vivian, that type of communication, it breaking in that communication system, it interferes with what it, how fast to move and to respond to a situation, whether it be a house fire, and that kind of, and we've lost facilities over that. The most recent one is a school in Utqiaġvik. I mean, we lost the entire school. I mean, a new gym just had been erected in the community of Utqiaġvik, and a fire broke out, and the communications was a bit slow, and the responders were in the extreme environment, Arctic conditions, -50 temperatures outside, and the water fire hydrants were not functioning like they should in the normal operations. So some of the hydrants were frozen due to the circulation pumps that were not functioning because of the cold temperature. So that's kind of an experience that we have here in the, on the North Slope. You know, there's similarities to situations to call on police in a different situation. I used an example of we don't quite have the infrastructure or capabilities. We don't have the US Coast Guard present like in other big areas like Seattle or even down in the Southeast Alaska. We have the Coast Guard availability in just a matter of minutes in the event there's a ship stranded. Here we have to act on our own. We don't have that. The nearest US Coast Guard port is 700 miles south of us, and it's going to take several hours for them to respond. That kind of distance. The North Slope is a very large area as well, you know, and clearly across the top of the state of Alaska, all on the north side of the Brooks Range, and the distance that spans between the villages are hundreds of miles between. I think the closest community is like 90 miles. Wainwright, maybe Utqiaġvik 87 miles. But that in terms of comparison to the vastness of the areas that we have to identify within our region. I hope that helps with your question.
It does. Thank you, Liz.
Yeah, just briefly, I think both Vivian and Mayor Brower have captured a lot of the same challenges that we have in our region. I think there are three things I would offer. One is that I think what you touched on, Vivian, too, is we find that in our communities, if there is a crisis and an individual is acting out in the community and there is no trooper or VPSO or VPO on the ground, then oftentimes our community health aid practitioners end up being a responder in a situation where they do not have training to deal with de-escalation. And so I remember an incident where we had someone who was eventually detained and they were at the clinic waiting for a trooper to show up, and that individual didn't need medical treatment, but that's where they were. And so we are putting people in position to deal with things that they really are not trained for. And it's not a matter of giving that person training, it's a matter of getting the right person with the right training in the community. The other piece that I would point out, and something that I'm really grateful for, and I'm not sure, I haven't had a chance to ask other regions, is that public safety officers, whether it's a VPSO, a state trooper, or a village police officer, are one component of public safety. One thing that I'm grateful for in our region, and we have had times when this has lapsed, is there are other components of infrastructure related to public safety that are important. And one of those components that we have in our region is that we have a child advocacy center. And what that is that if a child has been assaulted in some way, whether it's physical or sexual assault, which unfortunately does happen, that they do not have to wait in their community to get on a plane and then travel to Fairbanks or Anchorage, which are hours away from their village. So if something happens to a child, I'm just saying randomly as an example, in our upper Kobuk communities like Kobuk, they would have to get on a plane, take an hour flight to Kotzebue. And if that child advocacy center wasn't in Kotzebue, they would have to wait to get on a flight to Anchorage or Fairbanks either that same day, which is another hour and a half, or the next day. And in that time frame, there are certain things that cannot happen in order to process that individual. And this impacts the ability for individuals, whether it's a children or a family member, to come forward and feel like they can get the support that they need to respond in these incidences. And I think those are things to keep in mind as we talk about where infrastructure is located in these vast distances. There's a real and practical impact on responding to an incident in a village, but also real and practical impact on people who may be victims and need support right away. And there may not be someone on the ground who's trained to deal with the situation. Another thing that I think is important to note is there's this tension sometimes that I hear right in our communities, and I might be saying this at an extreme and it's not intended to be offensive, is that there is often quick response to wildlife enforcement and subsistence issues on our people versus the support that is needed to support our communities when it comes to public safety. And so where the value is placed and the resources are placed for that kind of response is something that is of great concern, I think, to our communities, is that we want to see that collaboration to support subsistence, but it's very challenging to see enforcement on our own people on those issues, but little to no support on the public safety side. Thank you, Mike.
Those are three powerful responses to a really important question. I think it just highlights for all of us how much these communities, how much you all have to sort of fend for yourselves, provide the basic infrastructure and services, knowing full well that you have other partners, of course, but how much you have to provide for the community because of the location, but also vast resources and vast distances. It's astounding when you hear about, I need a right and a left arm, a healthcare professional and a public safety officer, but Liz digging down to to the complexities of the community and the needs of the community and where the priorities are, proactive versus reactive. And then Mayor Brower, just thinking about the span and the scope of the area, it is 700 miles to the Coast Guard, but that's an airplane ride, not rescue ships and other support vessels and entities coming to the rescue of a fisherman or a cruise ship or whatever. So we are dealing with, in a lot of ways, islanded communities that have to really provide a whole lot of services to provide not just sustaining communities, but really thriving communities. So thank you all for doing that. I'm watching the clock. I do want to get to the questions coming in. Gail, if I could just turn to you for a moment. You scanned out from really palpable issues here about safety in the villages to the international arena, where Alaska, the strategic Alaska situation is, right? With Russia, China, the United States, Arctic policy, Alaska policy, co-management, ports. You scanned out to the more strategic location of the Bering Strait. You mentioned the Port of Nome. Of course, we know about the Port Clarence. We talk about structures that are connected to support a whole number of things. Can you just talk a little bit more about the importance of a port or port systems, yes, for national security, but what that should do for economic diversity in your region as well? Maybe just dig down a little bit more on that.
Sure. In the research that I've done in the past, Russia had constructed or renovated like 16 different port systems along their side of the Bering Strait. And we, of course, have ports in Alaska, but they are so far south that they really are not helpful in terms of where we're located in the Bering Strait. I think that the government really has an obligation to ensure that as the Arctic continues to open up, and in part, that's because of climate change and the impacts that we are experiencing in the Strait. It's not only a responsibility that the government has that I think that they need to follow through on, but also I think showing that, in fact, Alaska is an Arctic state, and that it's for many reasons, Alaska is kind of put in the corner. We made some bump in terms of being recognized when oil was discovered on the North Slope and the Trans-Alaska Pipeline was built. That was probably the largest infrastructure construction in the history of Alaska. And now I think that we need to look coastal to ensure that we have the capability to not only protect our people, but to protect ourselves from other vessels that might be traversing the strait. If there were catastrophic grounding of a vessel, for example, that could really wipe out not only the communities surrounding that grounding, but other communities, because we're still subsistence-based people. And anything that might impact those subsistence resources would be, critically endangering to our people. It's, nice that we're able to get beef and chicken eggs and that sort of thing into the villages, but a lot of us still prefer our subsistence foods. And so I think that, you had mentioned that I'd mentioned the Port of Nome. I think that is really an excellent opportunity for the government to really show that they have, that we are an Arctic nation, that we are an Arctic state, and that we can construct and utilize infrastructure on our side to ensure that our coastline is protected, and not have to, call upon China to loan us an icebreaker, or Russia to, send something over that we can utilize to clean up an incident in the strait. So hopefully that will, with the trillions of dollars that are currently being budgeted for infrastructure, I'm hopeful that, that some of that will be utilized to build Arctic infrastructure.
Thank you, Gail. Yeah, the port there, and of course the possibility, opportunities for Port Clarence as well, but to have a corridor that is thinking about our national security, our food security, monitoring fisheries, all of those things that goes beyond just the national security component. So thank you for noting that. We've got about 15 minutes left. Joshua, I'd like to bring you into the discussion. I will just say that, well, I'll speak for myself. More well-seasoned hands are on this Zoom call with us, but you represent tomorrow. You represent the future of our Arctic. Many of the individuals here have been working on Arctic and Alaska issues for a very long time. And so I'd like to hear from you, your thoughts about a couple of things. And I'm very happy that you're part of that Emerging Leaders program. But when you close your eyes and think about a decade or two down the road, what does your generation, what do you see? Alaska and the Arctic and the area that ICC covers, what do you see when you close your eyes and you think about what those tomorrows look like? What are you trying to shape in the North? What are the priority issues for you? And I realize it's a very big set of questions, so you could take any of those, but it would be helpful for us to know what you think that the North and the Arctic should look like in relation to ICC.
So yeah, great question. I think there's a lot of different ways you can respond to that, but I think I'll just take the broader picture and say that, at least for me and some of the people I've spoken with within our own ICC Emerging Leaders group, the big picture, 10 years down from the line, we're looking for kind of an inclusive situation where all voices are heard and taken into consideration when decisions are made. And the most important part is that any decisions that are made that have to do with any of our land or our people or our culture are done by us, by our own people. Those decisions are made by us and not by other people telling us how we should manage our natural resources or how we should manage our hunting and fishing. That at the end of the day, the grand goal is that, those, issues that, take decision making get made by the people who will be affected by. And I mentioned being, inclusive of many different points of view. That's also one important part of what we've discussed within our own group is that, a lot of times I'm a youth now, I guess, but I won't be a youth in 10 years. But one thing that has come up and that continues to come up is that, fortunately, we don't have any of this issue with ICC or any of our partners, but sometimes, organizations will include youth just to, check the box, and there's not really any voice or any, pull with any of the decisions or whatnot. So having meaningful engagement and, actually taking in, I guess, a younger's perspective on issues that are going on throughout, Inuit is very important. And I think that, like I'd mentioned, ICC does a great job of that along with our partners here. But I think there's also some other places where other organizations can continue to, open that door and be more inclusive with, a younger voice and what's going to happen, I guess, tomorrow.
Very good. Thank you for taking on that big set of questions. I appreciate it, and it's good to have that. Good to have that vision. Good to share that vision with us. Vera, I'm going in sort of order, but questions are coming in, and I'm trying to package those questions along with the questions that I had, which is nice to see that others too had these kind of questions. You spurred a lot. Vera, there's a question that I'd like to direct to you, please. And the question is this, I'm going to paraphrase here. How do co-management of resources and the need for infrastructure intersect? Do they conflict, enhance, enable? How might those two intersect, if they do at all?
Well, like Mayor Brower said, our co-management has a lot of mandates that are not funded. And one of the issues that we have is that we have a co-management organization that does not have enough funding. So that's one of our recommendations, that we needed adequate funding long-term so that we can address all these issues that our communities are facing in reference to marine mammals, because 80 to 90% of our diet comes from the marine mammals. And, you know, we want to ensure Indigenous knowledge, the knowledge that our communities possess, can be part of research, the academics, the science, to come up with solutions jointly. So I always say that our communities are here and often are the first ones to see the changes in the environment. And we try to respond to these changes as best as we can. But, you know, being Alaska Native and I've been born and raised out in Savonga for many years, we've seen changes, but again, like many of our presenters have said, we're here, we've been adapting through the changes, and we live in a co-management environment with our federal partners, like for my work, Fish and Wildlife Service, who do the science for us, along with our hunters, who are often involved in research cruises now, who can provide the knowledge that have been inherent in many of our people for centuries. So it's unique. It's something that I truly believe in, because science can't provide all the answers for us. It has to have Indigenous knowledge, which can, you know, provide balance within the environment. So I hope that's a response to a very good question. So thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Thanks to the few folks that had the questions that I just kind of consolidated there as well. I have a couple of more questions, and then Daly, I'm going to come back to you for a wrap up, but also a particular question about the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. But Mayor Brower, I have one directed mostly to you, sir, if you don't mind taking that on. And in fact, several of you may want to take a run at this. An aggregate of the questions are the following: How do we strike the right balance to develop our natural resources while protecting the environment in the state of Alaska? A classic question for those of us that live here. Mayor Brower, would you mind taking that one?
Oh, that's not an easy question, but yes, thank you for the question. You know, we had to identify with our past administrations in the communications of responsible development. We have to identify and structure the communications to where responsible development is put into action for what area of interest is looking to be developed. Was it in the ocean? Was it onshore? These are the more important questions. If it's offshore, there's a little bit more criteria that we need to identify with to developing offshore. Do we have the very discussion point, the infrastructure needs to meet a situation of a oil spill or release of hydrocarbons, you know, that become out of control? Do we have those measures in place to be responsible for a situation like that? But there's preventive measures that are also identified on the other side of the discussion point of responsible management. Preventive measures that help derive answers to a lot of the questions that are of concern. Safety within the environment, conditions imposed on the operators that are looking to conduct exploration or development on offshore resources. In bringing them back onto shore, that communications from our past leadership has been that it's a lot safer to operate onshore than it is offshore. We were dealing with a lot of comparatives to what we can do offshore and onshore. And to be onshore, we're able to respond and maybe control the situation in a relief of hydrocarbons. Those were the kind of examples that the discussions circled around to a responsible development opportunity, or scenarios that were in discussion with industrial operators, with the local managers, with our federal government and the state governments, all being brought in to discuss these various issues of responsible development for hydrocarbons. That's basically where we've been focused on the North Slope. The other minerals, I think that it's still within the periphery, but we need to develop, as if diversification is to come into play into other resources, that's something that we'll have to build on as to where and what is being considered for developing or exploring other resource extraction. I hope that helps with your question.
It does, Mayor. Thank you. Would anyone else, let me scan the screen here. Would anyone else like to speak to that question?
And Mike, I can add a little bit if that's all right. So in
Please.
in our region, I think as I shared, and I know I went through my presentation pretty quickly. So the Red Dog mine is either the second or first largest zinc mine in the world, depending on the day, related to production. And so we deal with something a little bit different than the North Slope does in mineral development. And I think one of the components I think that's important to keep in mind when looking at the potential for resource development, I often share with people, we have our subsistence committee and then other requirements around shareholder hire and development that are really important. And those are in place because we're the landowner. And we're able to negotiate access to our resources to ensure that those things are in place. For areas where that may not be the case, and even in our experience, I think that with operations at Red Dog is the value that the subsistence committee provides to operations to minimize impacts is really important. In the global mining context, one of the highest, I think one of the key indicators of investment is whether or not there's social license to operate. And so whether we're talking about hydrocarbons or minerals, I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. So in working with communities and finding that balance, it's really important to engage. And I think for agencies in particular, what comes to mind to me is ensuring that we're utilizing tools around consultation with tribes, consultation with ANCs, and engaging our local municipalities or our boroughs, because together we represent the community. And so finding those solutions is really incumbent upon working with us and really looking at how things can be done, if they can be done, and then ensuring that those closest have a benefit from that operation. And so I think those are key components that I would put on the table, and that traditional knowledge can augment and improve operations, which is something that we've seen at Red Dog, as well as some of our other exploration activities in the Upper Kobuk.
Thank you, Liz, very much for that response. I'm just scanning to see if anyone else has a comment on that. We've got about 2 minutes left to the program, and I do have one more question and then a wrap. Seeing none. Daley, perhaps I can put you on the spot for two things. One would be this question, and then the second, just your final thoughts before I do a wrap. But the issue of the Central Arctic Ocean's Fisheries Agreement, which now has entered into force, of course, spans the Central Arctic Ocean. ICC has interest and equities in whatever happens related to now putting a research portfolio together in an international research effort forward now to explore that particular area of our landscape. What role might ICC play in informing what happens going forward with the efforts related to the agreement?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I think it's really significant that the agreement was put in place, and significant that it makes specific reference to Arctic Indigenous peoples, that it makes explicit reference to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that it also makes explicit reference to Indigenous knowledge. And this then creates an opportunity for us, the Inuit Circumpolar Council specifically, to enter into the current discussion about the scientific research as it moves forward. And of course, our insistence, as has been said by a number of presenters, is that Indigenous knowledge be respected and recognized in this context in a genuine and a meaningful fashion. And certainly, especially those out of the Alaska office, Jimmy Stotts, Carolina Behe, others in the Alaska office are watching that space to ensure that we are meaningfully engaged and that Indigenous knowledge and its relevance to the implementation of that new international treaty is actually respected and recognized and taken into account. So it's very significant. It also links to what Gail introduced in her presentation about the geopolitical nature of the Arctic region and the real potential for those additional 5 states that are not within the Arctic sphere geographically, but have their eyes set on the region, for them to recognize and respect that Inuit do have a voice and do have a role in the implementation of this agreement. We know for a fact that China is constantly scanning the globe for energy security, food security, a whole host of things. So in this regard, it harkens back to what Joshua has said about the future that he wants, the future that our young people want, and that is to have our voice in every relevant fora. And we're the ones who decide what the relevant fora is. And if it happens to be the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement and the significance of Indigenous knowledge, then we have to have a rightful place in that context and in a fashion that is genuine and meaningful and ends up in the policies that emerge and the final decisions that emerge, whether it's in relation to the scientific research or how the agreement is implemented in the future, and even more significantly, after this present moratorium expires.
Thank you for the great response, Delia, as usual. Thank you very much. Do you want any last, we're just a little bit over time here. Do you want any last comments? And then I'll do a very quick wrap and thank everyone. Any last thoughts?
Yes, I wanted to make some announcements about future events. I have many papers in front of me with notes, but we've been very fortunate to have extraordinary amount of substance shared with us throughout this short period of time. But I wanted to announce that in terms of future events, the Inuit Health Summit is going to take place. It begins September 20th. It'll run through 6 virtual sessions until October 26th. And this is in lieu of holding an in-person Circumpolar Inuit Health and Wellness Summit. So we've had to divert to a virtual program because of the pandemic. I also want to note that it's my hope that in the future we can do an event similar to this, but that is international in nature, and to invite our leadership from the Russian Far East and Chukotka, as well as Canada and Greenland, to share their particular perspectives on many of these same questions. In addition, as was referenced by Joshua and I believe Liz, the ICC will host its next General Assembly in July 2022 in Inuit, Greenland. In addition, we may end up having future thematic sessions. I know there's been brief discussion about the possibility of highlighting International Inuit Day, which is November 7th. We'll see what emerges at that time. The other item I want to share is the various different websites of the ICC Alaska office, as well as Canada and Greenland and Chukotka. I encourage all of the participants that have joined us today to visit those particular sites and learn more about the work of the ICC. Finally, I think that today's session, in terms of the national or the domestic focus that we've brought forward here, that those who are associated directly with federal agencies and offices, that you've really heard the messages that have been brought forward by our leadership, and that you take into account in any policy and decision-making that your agencies do, the important status, role, and rights of Inuit as people, not only who seek to enjoy and exercise these rights, but also, as has been underscored by many, have the responsibility to their people and future generations for a whole host of issues, as has been illustrated in this brief opportunity to share virtually. Finally, I look forward to an in-person event where we can not only have frank discussion like that introduced by Liz, but to also maybe have an opportunity for one-on-one dialogue with specifically federal policy and decision makers, as well as a reception and a cultural event that allows us to express ourselves culturally and inclusive of elders as well as youth. So once again, thank you, Mike and Michaela and everyone at the Wilson Center for this opportunity, and I look forward to future collaboration.
Thank you, Daly, and thank you, Treyon and Tracy back at the studio for making this all happen. And thank you all, Mayor Brower, Daly, Joshua, Liz, Vera, Vivian, Gail, Michaela. Thank you. This was an extraordinary 2 hours plus a few minutes. So thank you to my friends at the Wilson Center for tolerating the overrun. And I will look forward to ensuring that we do this again. And this will all be posted to the website. And for those of you who asked questions and I was not able to get to them, I apologize. We'll hang on to those and do our very best to follow up on them. So to all my friends and colleagues, thank you very much for an extraordinary discussion. I look forward to doing it again. Thank you all.